Okay, so today I'm going to talk about seventh chords. A seventh chord is a chord which has, in addition to the three different tones of a triad, for example, a C major triad has a root, a third, and a fifth. Right? Every triad has some kind of root, third, and fifth. And if we add a seventh, for example, this is a major triad with a major seventh. This is a seventh chord because it has that additional tone, the seventh. There are 5 commonly used seventh chords in tonal harmony. Actually, there's many more seventh chords than that, but there's only 5 that ended up being commonly used. And each of those 5 is built on either the major triad, the minor triad, or the diminished triad. There are no commonly used seventh chords in classical tonal harmony that are built on the augmented triad. It's possible to have them. In fact, if you take all the different permutations, remember we have 4 different types of triad, right? We have, in whatever order, major triads, minor triads, diminished triads, and augmented triads. Those are the only 4 different possible triads. Of course, they could be inverted, but in terms of triad types, those are the only 4. If we consider that we have 3 different types of seventh that we could add, we have major sevenths, so from C a major seventh is B, minor sevenths, and also diminished sevenths. Diminished seventh is enharmonic to the major sixth, but whereas if I'm considering this interval a major sixth, I would call it A, coming from C. If I'm considering a diminished seventh, I would actually call it B double flat. Or maybe I would call this note B sharp, and this note would be A, but either way it would be spelled as a seventh, not as some kind of a sixth. Notice there's really no use for an augmented seventh, because that would be enharmonic to the octave, right? It's possible in theory to have an augmented seventh, but in practice you're just never going to see it. Okay, so because we have 3 different sevenths, and we have 4 different triads, it's possible theoretically to have 12 different seventh chords, right? But in practice, only 5 of them are commonly used. And here they are, in again, no particular order, but let's start with the one that I played first, the major seventh chord. Notice I'm calling it a major seventh chord. The first major is referring to the triad type, and the second major is referring to the seventh type. And I try and be extremely particular and correct when I teach about seventh chords. You might have some people say, oh, that's a major seventh. Or they might say it's a major seventh chord. If we're going to be really picky about it, we really should call it a major seventh chord. We should not call it just a major seventh, because a major seventh is just an interval. If we're talking about a chord, we should call it a major seventh chord, so that we're clear on both the triad type and the seventh type. Okay, so the major seventh chord, there it is. Next, the major minor seventh chord. Major triad with a minor seventh. This one is commonly called the dominant seventh chord because it naturally occurs on the dominant. Let's say I'm in the key of C. If C is the tonic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's the dominant. Diatonically, I will naturally come up with a seventh chord that is major minor. If I'm just using the notes within the key of C major, for example, all the white keys, that's the chord that I naturally get on the dominant. So therefore it's sometimes called the dominant seventh chord. But the thing is, again, if we're going to be really particular and correct about this, we really shouldn't be calling it a dominant seventh chord unless it actually is on the dominant in a piece of music. Speaking in sort of an abstract way, taken out of the context of a piece of music, the chord itself, going back to building the same chord on C, is a major minor seventh chord. Whether it's built on the dominant or not, it's a major minor seventh chord. So that's what we're going to call it. Then the minor seventh chord. minor 7th. Right? Next, the diminished minor 7th chord, often called the half diminished 7th chord. If you say half diminished 7th chord, everyone kind of knows. Again, if I'm being consistent, I might want to call it the diminished minor 7th chord, but people usually call this half diminished. The triad is diminished, but the 7th is minor. So that's kind of why it's called half diminished. But again, to be really particular, we want to call it diminished minor 7th chord, although people usually don't. And then finally, the diminished 7th chord, more commonly called the fully diminished 7th chord, although sometimes just called the diminished 7th chord. And again, everybody kind of knows what you mean when you say, oh, a diminished 7th chord. But to be consistent, really, we should say it is a diminished triad with a diminished 7th, the diminished 7th chord, or the fully diminished 7th chord to distinguish it from the half diminished 7th chord. So those are the only 5 types that are commonly used. Especially in jazz or in, let's say, more contemporary music, you do find some unconventional 7th chords. Like, for example, the minor triad with a major 7th, the minor major 7th chord, which has this kind of film noir kind of sound. That's a chord that is theoretically possible to construct. You just don't find it a lot in tonal music. So we're focusing on just the 5 that are most commonly used in tonal music. Of these 5, I'm going to talk about one in particular first a little bit, and that's the fully diminished 7th chord, because there's some kind of unique things going on in the fully diminished 7th chord. First of all, the fully diminished 7th chord is the only one where all of the intervals are minor thirds. Right? If we take each interval from one tone to the next, the fully diminished is all minor thirds. And in fact, we could keep going. And notice the distance from, in this case, B double flat. Remember, if I'm writing it out, I've got to call this note B double flat, because if it's going to be a real 7th chord, it's got to have a root, in this case C, and then E flat, G flat, B double flat. Notice from the B double flat up to C is also 3 half steps, and harmonically equivalent to a minor third, although it's actually an augmented second, but it sounds the same as a minor third. So you can actually think of the diminished 7th chord as sort of a fully diminished 7th chord, diminished 7th chord, as a chain of minor thirds. And here's another thing, that because the intervals are all the same, the fully diminished 7th chord sounds the same in all of its different inversions. You cannot tell, actually, what inversion it's in unless you see it written down. If you see it written down, you can tell the inversion. I'm going to talk about inversion of 7th chords in a minute. But just hearing it out of context, there is no way of knowing what the inversion is. Because all the intervals are equidistant. Right? Another aspect of this is that there are really only 3 different fully diminished 7th chords on the keyboard. If we kind of leave aside inversion, we've got 3 different chains of minor thirds running up the keyboard. And again, it doesn't really necessarily matter in this case what I'm calling these pitches. So here's one of those chains, the one that begins on C, or that includes C and E flat or D sharp, or F sharp and G flat, or A or B double flat. All right, so here's one of those chains, and it continues up. And here's another one, the one that includes C sharp, possibly D flat, E, possibly F flat, depending on how we're spelling these tones, E or possibly F double sharp, and B flat or possibly A sharp. Again, it doesn't really matter what we call them. In terms of visualizing them on the keyboard, which is very handy, you can see that this chain runs up the keyboard there's only one left, and that's this one. This one is a little different because it's got 3 white keys and 1 black key. And it includes the notes D and F, or possibly E sharp, depending on how the chord ends up being spelled. A flat or G sharp, depending on how we're spelling the chord. B, or possibly C flat, depending on how we're spelling the chord, right? But you can see here's some other chain. So each of these are a half step apart from each other. This one, this one. If I go up another half step, oh, notice I'm back in this chain that I started with that includes C, right? So there's 3 different sort of threads running up the keyboard, and they form a fully diminished 7th chord, and it's a good way of visualizing them and sort of keeping track of them on the piano. All minor thirds, possibly augmented seconds, depending on how you spell these tones. Okay, so that's the fully diminished 7th chord. Some unique properties there. All the other 4 commonly used 7th chords have different intervals between them. So, for example, starting with the major 7th chord again. Okay, so we can think of it many different ways, and you should have many different ways of understanding it. You'll understand it better if you understand it from different perspectives. But you could say, okay, it's a minor triad with a major 7th. You could also say, okay, from any given note, the intervals we have are a major 3rd, and then a minor 3rd, and then another major 3rd. Right? The major minor 7th chord. Major triad with a minor 7th. Okay, so from any given note, we go up a major 3rd, a minor 3rd, and then another minor 3rd, and that gives us a major minor 7th chord. The minor 7th chord, well, from any note, if we go up a minor 3rd, and then a major 3rd, and then another minor 3rd, and there's our 7th. And then finally the half diminished or diminished minor 7th chord. From any given note, we go up a minor 3rd, and then a minor 3rd, and then a major 3rd, and that gives us the half diminished or diminished minor. Now, so far I've been showing all these chords in root position and in closed voicings, trying to keep the notes as close together as possible. Inversions of 7th chords. Well, just like we have inversions of triads, we have inversions of 7th chords. The difference is, since a triad has only 3 tones, 3 different tones, for example, there's our C major triad, that means there are only 3 different possible bass positions. We have root position, first inversion, second inversion. And it doesn't matter what kind of triad we're talking about. I happen to use a major triad, but of course the same is true of, let's say, minor triads. There's a root position, first inversion, second inversion. Right? With 7th chords, we have 4 different possible bass positions because we have 4 different tones. So here's, again, my major 7th chord. Here it is in root position. Here it is in first inversion. The root of the chord has been moved, in this case up here. It doesn't really matter where the root is. I could put the root up here. What matters is the 3rd of the chord is lowest sounding, and that's what makes it first inversion. If I make the 5th of the chord lowest sounding, and I put the other notes above that 5th, then I've got a second inversion 7th chord. And finally, if I have the 7th of the tone lowest sounding, then I've got a 3rd inversion 7th chord. Right? Now, keep in mind, I've just been showing them in closed voicings. If I have some kind of an open voicing, for example, here I'll play a root position, C major 7th chord. If I play an E down here, suddenly now this chord is in first inversion, because what makes it inverted is not really what's going on elsewhere. It's which of these tones is lowest sounding. Now here I've got actually the 3rd doubled. Doesn't matter if I double it or not. If I have the notes C, E, G, B with any of them doubled, but I have E lowest, then that chord is first inversion. Here it is second inversion. Here it is third inversion, root position. I could spread the notes out any which way I want. So for example, if I have E, G, C, B, right? This is a first inversion C major major seventh chord, just as surely as this is, or just as surely as this is something like this. Okay, now it's in terms of the different inversions. Just as in triads, we have different figured bass symbols, and a root position seventh chord will always have a 7 in the figured bass. When you're analyzing it with Roman numerals, or if you are realizing a figured bass, remember, a root position triad doesn't really need to have anything in the figured bass, because that's the assumption, right? That's the default. If you're doing figured bass, or you're analyzing with Roman numerals, and you have a root position triad, all you need to do is put the Roman numeral there, or if you're doing figured bass, you don't need to really indicate anything, because that's the default. And to review, root position, we don't need to indicate anything for triads. First inversion, we call it a 6 chord, and we have to indicate with a 6 if we're doing figured bass or if we're doing analysis. Second inversion is called a 6/4 chord, because we have, in addition to the 6th, we have a 4th from the bass. With seventh chords, first of all, we have to indicate the 7th, so we'd have to put a 7 in there. If we see a 7th, we can't just say, we have to indicate the 7th, because remember, the default is a triad, is a root position triad. If we see a 7th chord, if we're analyzing and there's a 7th there, we have to indicate that there is a 7th. All right, so this chord, for example, in C major would be 1 major, major 7. First inversion 7th chords we call 6/5 chords. So there's a 6 superscript and a 5 subscript. And this, as you can see, it indicates how we have a 5th and also a 6th in the chord. Now, we also have a 3rd, but the 3rd we don't need to indicate in the figured bass. The 3rd is assumed. So a first inversion 7th chord in figured bass is called a 6/5 chord. A second inversion 7th chord is called a 4/3 chord. Here's the 3rd and here's the 4th, so we have 4 subscript 3. Notice there's also a 6th there, but we don't need to say 6/4/3. All we really need to say is 4/3, and that's enough information in terms of figured bass analysis or whatever to tell us, oh, that is a second inversion 7th chord. Third inversion 7th chords are called 4/2 chords, because from the bass we have a 2nd and we have a 4th. Now, we also have a 6th from the bass, but again, we don't need to indicate. We don't need to say 6/4/2. All we need to do is say, it's a 4/2 chord. And that's good enough to indicate what inversion we are in. By the way, all this information is in, if you're using the Canian text, it's in chapter 3. Now, I have an older edition here. I think I have the 4th edition, but it's probably somewhere around page 50. So you can see they have a complete chart here for all of the different inversions, both for triads and 7th chords. Notice they're showing the chord in a closed voicing, but just because it's simpler. But in an open voicing, we could have these notes arranged in different octaves with different doublings or whatever, but what makes this chord, for example, root position, is the fact that, notice it's nicely stacked thirds, and that G is the lowest sounding tone, therefore it's a root position triad. So they give the full figured bass symbol up here and the common abbreviation down here. So notice again, for root position triads, you don't need to indicate anything in figured bass. That's the default. First inversion triad is 6. Second inversion triad is 6/4. We get to 7th chords, we have to indicate the 7 for a root position 7th chord. First inversion is 6/5, second inversion is 4/3, and third inversion is 4/2. Now, how these chords tend to be used in chord progressions, or how they occur diatonically, is another issue, but we can talk about that a little bit. The diatonic seventh chords are pretty straightforward in major keys, and you can easily form them in the key of C by just creating that seventh chord shape. Now I'm using 5, 4, 2, and 1. You could also do 5, 3, 2, and 1. Doesn't really matter. I think 5, 4, 2, 1 is a little more comfortable. But if I make that shape, right, and I'm just staying in C major just to keep things simple. If I keep that shape and I simply move up by step, I am going to create all of the diatonic seventh chords in the key of C major. Now, of course, they're going to be the same in other keys too. It's just that I would need to have some black keys if I were doing it in any other major key. But in C major, here they are. 1, as you can see, is a major, major seventh chord. 2 is minor, minor, right? Minor triad, minor seventh. 3 is also minor, minor. 4 is major, major. 5 is major, minor, the so-called dominant seventh chord, which only naturally appears on 5, actually. 6 is minor, minor. 7 is half diminished, or diminished minor. We've got a diminished triad and a minor seventh. Right? And then we get back to 1, and of course it's major, major again. Okay, if we do the same, again, I'm just going to demonstrate in one other key. Let's say in the key of D major. Okay, well now I have to remember I've got F sharp and C sharp, but my diatonic seventh triad, or chords, are going to turn out the same. 1 is going to be major, major. 2 is going to be minor, minor. 3 is also minor, minor. 4 is major, major. 5 is major, minor, the familiar dominant seventh chord. 6, minor, minor. 7, half diminished, diminished minor. And 1 is major, major again. Notice the only black keys that I played were F sharp and C sharp, so staying diatonic in the key of D. The diatonic seventh chords in major keys are always going to turn out to be major, major, minor, 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 major, 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 minor, 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 half diminished, and then major, major again on 1. In minor keys, of course, it's more complex because we have 2 variable scale degrees, right? Scale degrees 6 and 7 could be natural or they could be raised. However, most commonly, and this time I'll take A minor, most commonly, the sort of standard diatonic seventh chords in minor, the ones that Kamian refers to, for example, most commonly, 1 is minor, minor. Now, it could be minor, major, actually, because remember, scale degree 7 is variable. Sometimes we see an accidental in the key of A minor, and we have a leading tone on G sharp, but we're not usually going to find that on the 1 chord. We don't want, actually, in tonal music, we don't want that leading tone in the 1 chord, because the purpose of the leading tone is to lead to 1. So the only chords which are going to have the leading tone in them, that raised scale degree 7, are chords whose function it is to lead to 1. That would be the 5 chord and the 7 chord. So for this chord, we don't need that G sharp. We want G natural, actually. Okay, so the 1 chord in minor is going to be minor, minor. The 2 chord is almost always half diminished. Now, it is possible you could find a minor, minor 2 chord, because remember, scale degree 6, in this case, scale degree 6 is F or F sharp, right? But 99 times out of 100, if you see a 2-7 chord in a minor key, it's going to be half diminished. Right? The 3 chord in... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm thinking suddenly in A major. The 3 chord in A minor, or in any minor key, is going to be major, major, right? Now, it's possible, but very unlikely. Scale degree 7, remember, is variable. But the thing is, this would give us an augmented major 7th chord. We don't need to have G sharp in a 3 chord because that's not the job of 3. 3 does not usually lead to 1, so it doesn't need a leading tone, right? So 3 as a 7th chord in minor keys is most likely going to be major major. 4 in minor keys is most likely going to be minor minor. Now again, there's the possibility of actually a major minor if we have a F sharp, for example, if we have a raised scale degree 6, but that's very unlikely. 4 chords in minor keys, if they are 7th chords, are almost always going to be minor minor. The 5 chord is going to be major minor because remember the job of 5 is to lead to 1, and this chord is just not going to lead to 1 very well if it doesn't have the leading tone. This is not nearly as satisfying in tonal music as this. Right? So that means, interestingly, the 5-7 chord is the only chord which is major minor, most commonly major minor in minor keys, and it's major minor all the time in major keys. It's the only one that's the same, actually. Whether we're talking major or minor, the, again, dominant 7th chord has that very distinctive function, that unique kind of function, and it's the only diatonic 7th chord commonly that has the same quality in both major and minor, and it's unique. None of the other diatonic 7th chords normally are major minor like the 5 chord. 5 chord has a very powerful function, and it just kind of has to be that way if it's going to function correctly. So 5 is major minor. 6, well, depends. What kind of 6 are we talking about? Most likely, the 6 chord, if we make it on natural 6, right, in a minor key, it's going to be a major major chord again, okay? But it's possible to have raised 6 because the 6th scale degree is variable. If we are in the key of A minor, for example, we might have F natural, we might have F sharp, especially if we're, if we have a melodic minor scale going on in the bass or something, and that would end up giving us a half diminished 6 chord, but that's less common. More commonly, 6 would be major major. 7, well, usually when we have a chord built on 7 minor key, it's built on the leading tone 7, because the job of 7 is to lead to 1. Just like the job of 5 is to lead to 1, the job of 7 is to lead to 1 in a slightly more dramatic way. Right? Therefore, it's going to be built on the leading tone most of the time, and therefore it's going to be fully diminished. Right? Now, it is possible to have a 7 chord which is built on the plain old diatonic non-raised scale degree 7. And that would give you a major minor 7th chord, right? And it's even possible that this chord could lead to 1, but actually the way we would probably analyze this, if we were in the key of A minor and we encountered this chord, we would probably say, oh, that's not really 7. It's 5/7 of C. We're probably modulating from A minor to C major, because this chord we kind of expect to go that way. Therefore, we would say, well, this chord, depending how it functions, this chord is probably 5/7 of 3 in the key of A, because in A, 3 is C, and this chord sounds like that's where it's going to go, right? Now, what if this chord, however, what if it, instead of going to 3, went to 1? Well, we would say it resolved deceptively. That's what we call a deceptive cadence, but that's getting into maybe a different subject of the function of these chords. 7, the fully diminished 7th chord in minor keys is really the one you encounter much more frequently. All right. And you hear this all the time, like, for example, in the familiar, right? Okay, we have that bass note, and then we have 7, fully diminished 7, resolving to a major 1 in this case. Right? So that's, notice that chain of minor thirds, that dramatic chord. The fully diminished 7th chord has the most drama and tension. Notice it has 2 tritones in it. That one that I just played, there's a tritone here and another one here. Right? Very tense, dramatic chord, and it has lots of interesting characteristics that we'll get to a little bit later on. Okay, I think that's probably about all I got for. Oh, one other thing. And this is something I think I've already talked about in a previous lesson on in ear training. If we are trying to identify the different 7th chords, if we are hearing them in root position, if we're hearing them in a closed voicing, one easy way to identify these different 7th chords, as long as they're in a closed voicing, is to try and pick out where the second is, because in a closed voicing, any inverted 7th chord is going to have an interval of a second in there somewhere. Right? Now, the only one that you can't tell, that this doesn't work with, again, is the fully diminished 7th chord, because if I invert this chord, this diminished 7th from C to B double flat inverts to an augmented second. There's B double flat again and C. And the sound of the augmented second is enharmonically equivalent to the sound of the minor third. Therefore, you cannot tell what inversion you're in. But let's say I make this chord, instead of fully diminished, let's say I make it half diminished. Right? Well, now I've got a minor 7th. And when I invert this chord, that minor 7th inverts to a major second. And it's fairly easy to hear that second as being distinct from all the thirds that we find elsewhere from one tone to the next tone over, right? So here we're in second inversion, and the interval of a second is in the middle. Here we're in third inversion, and the interval of a second is on the bottom, right? So this is one relatively easy way to distinguish any of the other. So here, let me do the same thing with a major 7th chord. Okay? Now, if I'm in root position, there is no second. But as soon as I start to invert the chord, there's that minor second, because I've inverted the major 7th on the outside. Now I get a minor second somewhere on the inside. Now here it's on the top, because it's a first inversion chord. Here it's in the middle, because it's a second inversion chord. And here it is on the bottom, because it's a third inversion chord. Let's do the same thing with the major minor 7th chord. Okay, here's my minor 7th on the outside. That's going to invert to a major second on the top, in this case, because it's first inversion. In the middle, if it's in second inversion, and on the bottom if it's in third inversion. Notice how for each of these chords, third inversion has the most tension, because of the second, the most dissonant interval is in the bass, which gives the chord a lot of sort of potency. Finally, the minor 7th chord. Okay, here it is in root position. There is no second. There's only thirds and a 7th on the outside. Okay, once I start to invert the chord, now the second is at the top. Notice how, by the way, the first inversion minor 7th chord, some jazz guys would call this an added 6th chord. They would say, oh no, that's an E flat major triad with an added 6th. Well, that's one way of thinking of it, but classically minded or classically trained people would say, oh no, that is a first inversion minor 7th chord, right? I'll play the same chord on C, right? Jazz guy would look at that and say, oh, that's a C major triad with an added sixth. Classical guy would say, no, that's an A minor minor seventh chord in first inversion. Two different ways of describing the same thing. Okay, back to, where were we? Second inversion, here's third inversion. So listen for the second. If you hear a second, if you're doing ear training and you're working with seventh chords, if you hear a second in there somewhere, then it's an inverted seventh chord. Then you just have to hear, well, am I hearing the second at the bottom, in the middle, or at the top? Right? If you're hearing it at the bottom, it's a third inversion chord, a 4-2 chord. If you're hearing in the middle, it's a second inversion chord, a 4-3 chord. If you're hearing a second at the top, then it's a 6-5 chord. All right, that'll do it for now. We'll talk about other stuff later.